meeting to order. Welcome to the meeting of the 18th, number 18 of the House Common Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. The committee is meeting here today starting at, and I'll go at 3:43 Saskatchewan, 3:53 Saskatchewan time. Today's meeting is also taking place in using the new webinar format. Webinars are for public committee meetings and are available only to members, their staff, and witnesses. Members may have remarked that the entry to the meeting was much quicker and that we are immediately entering into an active participation, bearing in mind that we've had a little bit of delay here in getting the witnesses. All functionalities for active participants remain the same. Staff will be non-active participants only and can therefore only view the meeting in gallery view. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all participants at this meeting that screenshots and taking photos of your screen is not permitted. To ensure an orderly meeting, we have a few rules if we could follow, please. Interpretation in this video conference will work much like it is in a regular committee meeting, and you have the choice at the bottom of your screen to either use the floor, English, or French. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. And when you're ready to speak, you can click on the microphone to activate your mic. When you're not speaking, we'd ask that your mic should be on mute. To raise a point of order, during the meeting, committee members should ensure their microphone is unmuted and say point of order and to get the chair's attention. In order to ensure social distancing in the committee room, if you need to speak privately with the clerk or the analyst during the meeting, please email them through their committee email addresses. For those people who are participating in the committee room, please note that masks are required unless seated and when physical distancing is not possible. Now, with that, I would, and we have one witness here, and thank you, Ms. Bull, for being with us. And I'll invite her to have some opening remarks, and hopefully by the time she's done, we will have the second witness to proceed further. Ms. Bull, 5 minutes, please.
Ani, Tabitha Bull Indigenakas, Nipissing Indigenaba, Migisito Dem. Hello, my name is Tabitha Bull. I'm from Nipissing First Nation, and I belong to the OGGO clan. As President and CEO of Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, and all distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to provide you with my testimony and to answer your questions. Speaking to you from my home office, I acknowledge the land as the traditional territory of many nations, including Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. From the beginning of the pandemic, the government provided supports for business. A number of those supports were required to be remedied to include Indigenous businesses. CCAB has repeatedly highlighted the need for a navigator function specific to Indigenous business to assist with the understanding and uptake of the various programs. Indigenous businesses have found navigating the bureaucracy, which often does not consider their unique legal and place-based circumstances, a significant barrier to accessing the supports necessary to keep their businesses alive and maintain their well-being. The lack of targeted assistance for Indigenous business to utilize these government supports underlines the need for an Indigenous economic recovery strategy that is Indigenous-led, builds Indigenous capacity, and is well-resourced to support Indigenous prosperity and well-being. Such a strategy was not mentioned in the recent speech from the throne, nor the fall economic statement. We acknowledge the number of important renewed commitments that were made, but there was no mention of efforts to support the economic empowerment of Indigenous peoples, businesses, or communities. We hope that the government will use the upcoming budget to signal to new Canadians that Indigenous prosperity and economic reconciliation matters. During my previous appearances before the House of Commons Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs on May 29th and November 17th, I stated that unique circumstances facing Indigenous businesses were not initially considered when forming the eligibility of CEBA or Bill C-14. This left many ineligible for the wage subsidy. We appreciate that these gaps were remedied. However, we must not forget the additional burden the close to month-long gap had on many Indigenous businesses. Unfortunately, when the government introduced Bill C-9, which extended the benefits for rent and wage subsidies, CCAB again had to underline that the government did not consider the unique circumstances facing Indigenous business. In this case, it took 82 days to receive clarity from federal officials that Aboriginal Economic Development Corporations are likely not eligible for the rent subsidy. This delay and the disappointing response demonstrate that Indigenous businesses continue to be an afterthought when programs are designed to support Canadian business. In order to support sound federal policy development and effective interventions during the pandemic and in collaboration with leading national Indigenous organizations, CCAB undertook 2 COVID-19 Indigenous business surveys to understand the impact of COVID-19. From our most recent survey, we found that nearly half had to let go of staff. Although 57% of Indigenous businesses remained open throughout the pandemic, 30% of those businesses surveyed indicated they would survive less than 6 months without additional financial support. In this vein, I would like to underline that Indigenous businesses have repeatedly told us that they cannot take on any more debt. I also mentioned in my appearances at the House and Senate committees that numerous Indigenous businesses were prepared to readily provide PPE to meet Canada's medical needs. Lists of such Indigenous businesses were provided to numerous federal departments as early as March of 2020, but only a small fraction of the only $6 billion of federal procurement contracts for PPE was awarded to Indigenous business. In a press release of September 21st, 2020, it was noted that 7 Indigenous companies were awarded contracts totaling approximately $2.5 million. This equates to 0.04% of federal spend on PPE. We understand through discussion with PSPC and through our own combing of publicly available data, this value is slightly higher. However, we continue to be unable to obtain confirmation of the total spend from Indigenous businesses on PPE. To remedy this information gap, I would like to propose that this committee consider measures that would mandate government departments and agencies to report on their purchases from Indigenous businesses as part of their submissions to the main estimates and the supplementary estimates committee. Simply put, we cannot evaluate and improve upon what we don't measure and report. I would like to leave you with this point of consideration. Too often, Indigenous business concerns are an afterthought, resulting in Indigenous organizations like CCAB working to prove to government that their response have not met the needs of Indigenous peoples. A reasonable starting point to support Indigenous economic recovery would include procurement and infrastructure set-asides for Indigenous businesses and communities, respectively, and for government organizations to publicly report these expenditures. CCAB is committed to continuing to work in collaboration with the government, our members and partners to help rebuild and strengthen the path towards reconciliation and a healthy and prosperous Canada. Thank you all very much for your time. Chimigwech.
Thank you, Ms. Bull, for your presentation. And I see that Mr. McHattie is here with us, and we're going to let you just have a couple seconds to check your mic, and then we're going to throw you right to the wolves with an opening remarks, Mr. McHattie.
Hello, Mr. McHattie. Thank you very much. My name is Paul Cardania. I'm the clerk of the committee. Welcome to the committee today. If I could ask you to just say a few phrases with your microphone open, and we'll check your sound with the interpreters, please.
Good morning, or good afternoon. Are you able to hear me properly?
If you could say a little bit more, we'd just like to check that sound, please.
Perfectly. Good afternoon. My name is David McHattie.
And a little bit more, please. They are listening.
Okay. Very nice to see everybody today. I hope everyone can hear me. It was fantastic listening to the first witness.
That's great. Thank you, Mr. McHattie. The interpreters are indicating your sound is good. So I will turn it back to the chair to introduce your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk, and thank you, Mr. McHattie, by joining us and bearing with us as we go through this late hour. So I will give you the floor, if you can, for 5 minutes. I appreciate your opening statement.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone. My name is David McHattie. I'm Vice President of Institutional Relations for Tenaris in Canada, and I'm the Board Chair of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Canadians has been severe by any metric, and I believe that the impact will be lasting for a considerable period of time. I was appointed to the COVID-19 Supply Council to provide insight and expertise regarding impacts on the Canadian manufacturing sector and how it can better support Canada during this time of need. As an essential business for Canadians that directly generates 10% of GDP and employs directly 1.7 million Canadians, it is important that COVID-19 policy supports are developed with Canadian manufacturing in mind. Including direct and indirect impact, manufacturing amounts to nearly 30% of Canada's economic activity. Priority issues for Canadian manufacturers are important for all of Canada. Safety and health of Canadian manufacturing employees is the primary priority. The industry needed access to PPE, timely testing, and information to provide the goods essential for Canadians. Many manufacturers have ramped up or shifted production in response to the crisis to make more food, energy, PPE, and other healthcare and health sciences products or input products. While this sector has modified its production, it has also had new safety protocols and production regimes negatively impact its costs. As many countries restricted supplies, Canadians became more aware of how important a stable, secure, and flexible local manufacturing supply chain is to our national well-being. This is important for industrial products as it is for consumer products. Organizations like the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters were able to quickly transmit best practices through its training services and to connect to members. By creating the COVID-19 Supply Council, the federal government took a good step in reaching out to a diverse group for feedback, insights, and support. The diversity of this group led to stimulating discussion that benefited all. Initiatives undertaken by the government that connected suppliers and buyers, to establish a contingency reserve for strategic products, and to inspire the expansion of Canadian supply chains have been lauded universally. Considering that we're all learning lessons from the past 15 months, it is important that we continue to ask ourselves questions. The definition of essential goods, how has this changed for Canadians? Manufacturing does matter. Can we develop ideas and produce them here to supply ourselves and the world? How can we stimulate more domestic supply of essential goods and industrial policy through industrial policy and procurement strategies? How can we inspire Canadians to buy more local without limiting the benefits from globalization? It's with the spirit of questions like these that the Supply Council worked, and I appreciated the opportunity to participate and to contribute, and felt like the government was listening to the views of manufacturers and exporters and Canadians broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McHattie. We'll now go into our first round of questions, and we'll start with Mr. Paul Hughes for 6 minutes.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our two witnesses. I will start with you, Ms. Bull. You mentioned that there was an issue concerning the organization, the contracts for Indigenous people, and there was a lack of transparency, but I would like to know, as a member of the procurement committee, how many meetings have you had from the very beginning? First question. And if you had more than 3 meetings, I would like to follow up with the minutes as well, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So in my recollection, I actually, in preparation for this, went back to look. We had 4 scheduled meetings. One I was unable to attend during the course of the Supply Council.
Okay. Merci. Donc, vous...
Thank you. And you, Mr. McHattie, you said that there was discussion that was stimulating and interesting. At what level were you involved in the planning of purchases? Did you have your chance to weigh in? For example, Honeywell proposed N95 masks and was refused. Were you involved in the discussions about that type of purchase?
Thank you. The meetings of the Supply Council, the COVID-19 Supply Council, didn't discuss specifics, but rather discussed broadly concepts of a desire to expand the supply chain to include Canadian businesses and to assure that the businesses in Canada were able to get supply.
Mais donc, est-ce que...
So, were they discussions more for the future or in the immediate? Did you have to react quickly to Canada's needs?
So some of the discussions were about presenting ideas like the supply hub, and we were given a very good presentation from those that were developing it, and we gave, where appropriate, some feedback on how that could work for us, and how we could help expand the concept to connect with as many Canadian businesses as possible.
OK, je comprends, là.
Okay. So also, for example, the reports of conflict of interest. Normally, if I look at the other committee that was established for vaccines, there was disclosure, proactive disclosure. There were companies participating in the committee signed agreements about conflict of interest. But on your committee, we didn't see anything. Were you asked to sign a disclosure agreement for probable conflict of interest?
We did sign a disclosure agreement. Yes.
Est-ce que vous aimeriez que ça soit public?
Would you like that to be published on the Government of Canada's website to avoid any issue? Would you like the minister to publish it?
I don't have a position one way or the other whether that should be published or not.
OK, et vous?
And you, Ms. Bull, on your end, did your organization sign a conflict of interest agreement? And if so, would you like it to be made public?
We did, yes. I don't have a specific position at this time, but I wouldn't have a concern with it being public that we signed a conflict of interest.
OK, merci.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. In the analysis, well, because for us, your involvement, I understand that you're doing analysis for the future, but in the short term, do you have a chance to weigh in on contracts that were signed, for example, for respirators? The government ordered 40,000 respirators, and we saw that we received about 21,000. So it would seem that we have far too many. Are these questions that you raised in the meetings, for example, to say that we should stop spending hundreds of millions of dollars on this because we no longer need this type of equipment, or are you not involved in that sort of discussion?
We were not involved in the details of those kinds of discussions. We were only sharing our concerns and our interest in finding more supply and finding ways that supply and the inputs for that supply could be provided by Canadian businesses.
Dernière question.
Last question. Simply, given everything that we've lived through, do you think that Canada is too dependent on China for a supply of essential products like masks, gloves? Do you think our dependency on China is too high?
My personal view is that Canada benefits when we can have a greater supply at home and local, and that this pandemic has taught us that well, there are many benefits to globalization and having a diverse source of supply. Nothing can replace having a capability at home that is secure, flexible, and available to Canadians.
Thank you, Mr. McHattie. And now we'll go to Mr. McKinnon for 6 minutes. Mr. McKinnon, you're on mute. Oh, there you go.
I believe it's Mr. Drouin.
Oh, okay. I apologize. Mr. Drouin for 6 minutes.
I thought it was Mr. McKinnon myself, but I'll take the 6 minutes. It's fine. Mr. McHattie, just wondering, you said can you explain to us the role of the supply council? And I've heard you interchange with Mr. Paulus, but just on the overall strategy of what you were trying to achieve in terms of representing your members, but also helping Canada procure the PPE that they needed.
Yeah, the objective that, as a member of the council, that I had, and representing Canada's manufacturers and exporters, was to provide some insight, some ideas, and provide some feedback. We knew that we were being asked to, especially in those first challenging months, to provide fairly quick feedback on ideas and initiatives that the government was working towards. And our view, or my view, was where we can, to see where we can especially as the economic recovery was, people were beginning to talk about how we can recover. My view was creating a stable, secure supply in Canada has a benefit for Canadians, and that there are many businesses that are wanting to step in and support the recovery of Canada, and that where possible, providing a local supply would be very valuable inside the overall context. The objective was to provide advice and insight. We knew that we weren't participating in any decision making, or that our views were being listened to as council only, but weren't being used for decision making.
Yeah, and I'm sure other MPs sort of have the same stories as I do, but I know that in my writing, I know that, for instance, Talmar Safety was not in the business of manufacturing visors or health gowns, but they retooled quickly to supply the local hospitals. I'm sure that you've heard very similar testimonies from many of your CME members.
Definitely, and without a doubt. And in those first months, manufacturers moved as rapidly as they could to try and serve the communities where they operate, where their people are employed, where their customers were. And from coast to coast across the country, there were manufacturers stepping in to try and do that. And they did so at often their own cost, because they were in an environment where you had to operate with different production regimes, often starting a product from scratch or adapting an existing product is often a higher cost. And so it was very valuable to be able to share with the government in many forms, including this forum, that where Canada could, if it could try and help and connect, use government procurement where possible, try and connect suppliers with buyers, was a great opportunity and would have an important benefit in communities across the country.
Great, thank you, Ms. Bull and Mr. McCarty. I just want to say thank you to all your members who stepped up big time and produced for Canadians so we could have those PPEs. It could have been a very different story had they not done that a few months ago. And same thing to you, Ms. Bull. I know a lot of Aboriginal businesses stepped up to the plate when Canada called, and I'd just love to hear what sort of the problematic issues that you've encountered. I know there's 28 contracts that were issued to Aboriginally owned businesses but I know I'm hearing you that we need to find a way to measure that better. And you said you'd love to see a way to provide the amount of contracts that were provided to Aboriginal owned businesses through the supply bills. Is that what you sort of said at the beginning?
Sorry, no. So that first press release came out. We did look into those businesses, and as we've looked into the publicly available data on PPE, we have seen that there have been more outside of that RFP. But the significant number of businesses that were able to answer that specific call from Indigenous businesses for non-surgical masks was well in excess of what was awarded. And we'd like to be able to see that publicly data available. So how many businesses, Indigenous businesses, were able to supply PPE to the Government of Canada in order for us to continue to move towards a minimum of 5% procurement target that's been set.
Okay.
Mr. Duran, you have 25 seconds still.
Well, I'll just take the opportunity to say thank you to Ms. Bull and her for stepping up to the plate as well. I certainly appreciate it, and we've seen some businesses pivot really quickly. And I know the Aboriginal community and First Nations communities across Canada have stepped up big time. So thank you. 25 seconds.
Thank you. Congrats.
Thank you, Mr. Drouin. And thank you, Ms. Bull. We'll now go to Ms. Vignola for 6 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I will go with Mr. McHattie and then ask a question of Ms. Bull. Starting with Mr. McHattie, the Supply Council since June 2020, has it met since then?
Yes, it has.
Combien de fois?
How many times?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that question. Did you ask when it did?
Combien de fois vous
How many times have you met since June 2020?
I believe we met once in December.
Okay.
Okay. To date, and I hope I'm not wrong, you are there to advise, you are there to make suggestions of possible solutions to the government. What recommendations were made to the government? Is there a list an official list on paper of recommendations made by the council?
Generally speaking, the interventions from council members and industry we were given the opportunity to share our insights verbally. We each often went around the room of providing ideas and feedback, and we didn't submit specific lists, although that didn't prevent any one of us individually from through email or other sharing further information between meetings.
D'accord, c'était plus.
Okay, so they were more informal meetings, if I've understood correctly, or brainstorming sessions on improvements to be made to the supply in Canada.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily classify it as informal, but because there was a structure, there was an agenda, but the aspect that you might term informal was that we each got the chance to speak and to share our insights verbally with Minister Anand and her team.
Okay.
We would formal reports, I guess, that's more the point.
Okay. Là, c'est dans ce sens.
Okay, so that's what I meant by informal, because even a formal meeting, everyone can talk, or at least I hope so. It's not a dictatorship in Canada. So in the subjects that you raised, were vaccines among them?
Yeah, they were included on the topic levels of how we could, or not how we could, but
Okay.
but the idea of doing as much as we could in Canada was something that many members, including myself, expressed an interest in finding a way.
Okay. Puis.
And in those discussions about vaccines, what were the strengths and weaknesses that your discussions highlighted? What should be improved?
From my perspective, I think Canada has strong universities, has strong infrastructure of people and ideas. What we lack sometimes, and in some areas, is specific manufacturing capabilities. And so we presented or discussed the interest in building on where we do have strengths and expanding them to eventually be able to produce strategic products like vaccines where we can in Canada. And so in this, we were speaking in a aspirational tone and a collegial tone, not assigning why we could not or why we did not, but more this was our aspiration that we felt it was important for Canada to do so.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bull, in your introductory remarks, you said that the impacts of the pandemic were significant for Indigenous businesses. You gave some numbers of closures and drop in business hours. In your opinion, are these impacts proportionally equivalent to what those experienced by businesses owned by visible minorities or white business owners? Do you think that the trend is more positive or negative among Indigenous entrepreneurs?
Thank you. So we do definitely see when we compare the results of our first survey to the Stats Canada surveys and the CFIB surveys that there has been more impact on Indigenous business. Part of that is because there's a larger proportion of Indigenous businesses that are small, medium entrepreneurs, but additionally access to financing and access to be able to participate in the programs that were available is also not equitable. So we have seen more of an impact on Indigenous and particularly more on women-owned businesses as well.
Thank you, Ms. Vignola. We'll now go to Mr. Green for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I'm hoping to carry on some of the questions related to procurement strategies for Aboriginal businesses. And I know that there are both mandatory and voluntary set-aside programs. And I'm just wondering, Ms. Bull, if you'd care to comment on whether or not, in your opinion, those set-asides were adequately considered with the size and scope of the procurement that happened over the duration of COVID.
Thank you. To my knowledge, under PPE and under the procurement under COVID, there were not set-asides specifically for Indigenous businesses. There was one RFP specific to Indigenous business for the non-surgical masks, as I spoke about before, but there were not set targets specifically in response to COVID.
So are you aware currently of our federal contractors program that has within it employment equity standards?
I don't believe I am. I'm aware of the PSAB program, which has employment requirements to be determined as an Indigenous business.
Yes, that's the bringing meeting, right, to procurement under PSAB.
Yes.
Well, I bring this to you because one of the motions that I brought before this committee was to look at this government's commitment under their existing policies on procurement, and one of them is the federal contractors program, which has an agreement to implement employment equity for contracts that are over $1 million. And so while not directly related to sole source procurement or procurement directly to Aboriginal businesses, certainly this would manifest itself in partnerships, strategic partnerships with manufacturers to ensure that they're meeting these employment equity standards. And so one of the requirements of this is that once a contractor receives an eligible contract from the Government of Canada, they must fulfill the following requirements. They must collect workplace information, complete workplace analysis, and provide an achievement report, and establish long-term and short-term goals on equity-seeking groups. And then to make reasonable efforts to ensure that reasonable progress is made towards having full representation of the 4 designated groups. The second designated group on the list happens to be Aboriginal peoples. And so I'm wondering if your council has had any conversations around how procurement through the federal government is reflected in this way, or if some of the small and medium-sized businesses have been approached to partner up on the federal contractors program to ensure these employment equity requirements are in place.
Thank you. So we have seen some situations in which small, medium, Indigenous-owned businesses have partnered to meet these contracts. One concern that we're currently looking at is whether the benefit actually results in supporting the Indigenous business, or if it's a numbers game, really, of meeting the employment equity, but without building the capacity within an Indigenous business, or without ensuring that the Indigenous business is able to benefit from the contract.
I would strongly agree. And I'll share with you, just for your own note and for the note of people who are on this committee and folks that are watching, that there's a compliance policy in this. And I've taken a keen interest to this because it also impacts many other groups. But in that if a contractor is found in non-compliance, then they'll be placed on what's called a federal contractors program limited eligibility to bid list. Why I bring that up as a note, because the footnote is that there's no names currently on the limited eligibility bid list. So based on a previous motion I'm bringing to your attention that you could bring back to your committee, it seems like it's the government's position on this policy that all of the contractors in the federal contractors program are in compliance, which quite frankly, I find very, very, very difficult to believe. So in wrapping up my questions in this round to you, Ms. Bull, I'm going to ask you to take the remaining time here to suggest you brought up a motion, but are there other clear ways in which we can ensure existing government programs are actually meeting the mandate, notwithstanding there's probably going to be a third wave? So knowing what we know now from your time on the council, what would be some recommendations this committee could take away to ensure that all the well-intentioned, good language programs of this government, bringing meaning to procurement, the set-aside programs for Aboriginal businesses are actually having tangible results for the communities in which they claim to support?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that opportunity. I think one thing that we definitely need to look at is, firstly, the definition that's used for Indigenous business under the PSAB criteria. That definition requires that a business demonstrate that 33% of their staff are Indigenous under the Indian Act. So that requires a business to obtain status cards or Métis carrying cards from their staff, which is not an easy conversation to have with your staff. And there's definitely Indigenous people in this country who do not feel comfortable providing their status cards and Métis cards to the Government of Canada for that reason. And if we look equitably across other minority-owned businesses, Black-owned businesses, or women-owned businesses, that requirement does not exist. So we are currently not treating Indigenous-owned business on an equal playing field. And for the remainder of COVID and for purchasing PPE or other products under COVID, I suggest we put a moratorium on that requirement to ensure that we're being equal to all businesses. The other is that— Do I have
any more time left, Mr. Kitchen?
Ms. Bull has about 5 seconds to answer any less you'd like to conclude.
Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to our second round, and we'll start with Ms. Harder.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. I very much appreciate your time. Certainly, the impact of COVID has been significant, and we've scrambled to respond. In particular, of course, last March and April, the government found itself in a situation where it had to scramble. And so originally, it would appear that the minister thought it would be a good idea to include Canadians in being the solution. And she talked a lot about, I quote, a collaborative approach that she wished to take at that time. And so out of this, she formed a special council composed of 16 individuals. Of course, the two of you were a part of that council. And of course, those 16 individuals were selected from a variety of different backgrounds, either from private sector or from not-for-profit. And the minister originally felt that you had the ability to offer helpful insights and to make recommendations to her. That's my understanding as to the intent. But then when we look at the minutes that were made available online or have been made available online, we see that you only had 3 meetings that have been posted publicly, but we found out today that there were actually 4. So originally there was a meeting on May 8th, another one on May 28th, another June 22nd, and then not until December. And the December meeting isn't actually reported online. However, you've commented that that meeting did take place. On May 8th, that was your first meeting, and according to the brief paragraph of explanation provided online, the only things that were done at that meeting was the minister greeted you, she thanked you for your involvement, She went over the terms of reference and then commented that the next meeting would be in 3 to 4 weeks without setting a concrete date and without really giving you your mandate. So then we find out that the next meeting was held on May 28th, so 3 weeks later. Now, we're in the middle of a pandemic at this time. The government was having a very difficult time procuring equipment, the PPE that was necessary to keep this country afloat. The minister said that she wanted a collaborative approach. She put these 16 people around a table who have incredible expertise to offer. But yet, she didn't feel it was necessary to bring you together for 3 weeks, again, in the middle of a massive crisis, arguably the worst since World War II. But the minister felt that she could go it alone, that she could make all sorts of decisions, spend all sorts of money without needing the expertise of industry, without needing the expertise of individuals who have collective wisdom to offer. I find that interesting because it would appear then that this council was more for the sake of appearances and looking like the government cared about the opinion of Canadians and bringing expertise into the room with them rather than actually doing so. And so it seems that then a blind eye was turned to qualified individuals, which it's disheartening because I think Canadians deserved to have your voices heard. And I think you guys had some really cool things that you would have been able to contribute had a meeting been convened during that important and crucial time from the beginning of May to the end of May when numerous decisions were made. I guess my question is, did you have the opportunity between meetings to submit advice or insight? Was there a mechanism by which you could do that, or was it simply only at meetings that were held by the minister?
I don't know, Tabitha, if you want me to go first, and my view, but between and the constructive criticism is, I think, is fair, and I think between May 8th and 28th, I'm not sure that criticism is all that valid because for all of
sorry, I'm not asking you to verify whether or not it's valid. I'm just asking if you had a way to give your insights in between meetings.
Sure, but when we had that first meeting, we went around and we generated, we gave a lot of ideas.
Was there a way to give input in between the meetings?
Yes, it was available to us to submit, emails in writing or short phone call. The minister and her team were available to us, and I'm all for constructive criticism. So don't get me wrong, but I think the between May 8th and 28th, there was a lot of work being done, and I felt at the time listened to and felt like what we had discussed in the May 8th meeting was being considered in the decisions that were being made by government, and the decisions were governments to make. We were providing some advice.
Mr. McCaddy, thank you. I guess what I'm wondering is if there was a meeting held today, I'm just wondering if you guys would have important things to contribute to that meeting. And
Ms. Harder, unfortunately, we're at the end of your time, and it was a great question. I'm wondering if Ms. Bull and Mr. McHattie if they could maybe answer that question in writing and just respond to us at that time. Would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to, I believe Mr. Weiler is next up.
That's right, Mr. Chair, and thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging I'm streaming from the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And my writing also includes the traditional unceded territories of the Sechelt, Lilwat, and Naquaqua nations. I'm very grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waters since time immemorial. And Ms. Bull, you mentioned the disproportionate impact to First Nations-owned businesses. And I've certainly seen it firsthand in my writing, particularly those that are involved in the arts, culture, and tourism sectors, of which there are many. And you mentioned the unique circumstances of Indigenous-owned businesses barred them from government COVID-19 relief programs. And I was hoping you could explain why that is.
Certainly, thank you. So initially, the first program under CEBA was designed for access through traditional financial institutions, and we know that only about 33% of Indigenous-owned businesses have relationships with traditional financial institutions. There was further funding that was provided, $307 million through the National Aboriginal Capital Corporation, to be distributed in the same way as CEBA through the Aboriginal financial institutions, but that money was not available to be distributed until late June. So again, a significant delay from when CEBA was announced. Then the wage subsidy program that was unrolled initially, Aboriginal Economic Development Corporations were not eligible for the wage subsidy, and that's because of the structure of how they're set up. We did have many discussions across government, and that again was also remedied, but it was about a 3-month delay from when other Indigenous businesses were able to access the wage subsidy in comparison to ECDEV corporations. And ECDEV corporations do employ a significant number of Canadians, Indigenous and non.
Absolutely. Well, with the funding through Aboriginal financial institutions and then the additional 133 million to support Indigenous businesses thereafter, has this gap now been filled in some of the inequities between maybe Indigenous owned and non-Indigenous owned businesses now been addressed and remedied?
For some, we have seen uptake of those funds. However, we do see a significant number of businesses that did not access the programs, and part of that is because the various bureaucracies in order to understand if the programs did fit for the business. We also see additional programs such as the rent subsidy program and other programs to support businesses through grants, that businesses that are on reserve and do not have a CRA number or did not have a CRA number prior to September 20th, 2020 are net eligible to access those programs.
Okay, no, that's helpful. And to one of the other points you brought up, in addition to set-asides and transparency in government contracting, what capacity building measures, kind of over and above maybe the Navigator program, would you suggest to help assist Indigenous-owned businesses better get involved in government procurement and contracting?
I think there's definitely a need for a closing the loop on procurement. So even some of the procurement that we saw specifically with PPE that Indigenous businesses were not eligible for or were not able to obtain the contract, when they asked to have a debrief to understand why, the answer was that it was a closed competitive procurement, and the way that procurement was set up did not allow for a debrief. So you have a number of Indigenous businesses who may have specifically pivoted to provide PPE and have now invested in being able to provide that do not have the opportunity to understand why their bid was not accepted. I think the other opportunity is those contracts that are under 25,000 that do not have to go through an RFP process often go to the same businesses that you would normally use. So we need to be able to grow the networks and connect through capacity building to Indigenous businesses so they can start to access those other opportunities as well. And then we have had some great opportunity with the Office Small and Medium Enterprise to conduct webinars for Indigenous businesses to understand how best to do business with the government.
And for some of those points that you raised, do you find that's consistent with, you mentioned that predominantly Indigenous-owned businesses are smaller or medium-sized organizations. Do you find that those are similar to non-Indigenous-owned businesses, or if it's particular disproportionate impact for Indigenous-owned businesses?
I have not spoken to my colleagues at the Black Chamber or WEE specifically about this. I think one thing that we do definitely find for Indigenous business is that quite often they're funneled towards one ministry, where if you're a women-owned business, you're not necessarily funneled to the Ministry of Gender and Equality. It's a government-wide solution, and there are government-wide programs for you. And for Indigenous-owned businesses, there definitely seems to be a funnel towards Indigenous Services Canada, and it really needs to be a government-wide approach.
Thank you, Ms. Bull and Mr. Weiler. We'll now go to Ms. Vignola for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. The Supply Council played a role as an advisor, well, I'll agree, and among the advice that Mr. McHattie and Ms. Bull gave is that we need to increase local production in the manufacturing sector. So, did you notice greater manufacturing availability following your recommendations? Do you think they were taken into account? Do you see tangible progress of positive impact of these meetings on the ground that took your precious time?
I see progress and would look at it as an investment. At the same time, I think there were many other initiatives ongoing, like the Industry Strategy Council, and so there were many things. They may seem like separate departments, separate topics, but we had conversations in many levels of how it could be that we can have better and more sustainable domestic supply, and the reasons to do it are very important, and it's really important that Canadians also ask for this. We can't always look to our governments to solve our problems. We as Canadians have to turn around and choose where we can from things that are more local. And so, I've heard messages from provinces, from the federal government. I think it's a step in the right direction, but we have a long way to go. And I think one thing we should be proud of as Canadians is that we are a very diverse society, and we have an opportunity to provide something that many other countries can't. And so when I hear Ms. Bull's feedback, it was an opportunity also for me to hear from other perspectives, so for me, I found high value in the conversations and appreciated them.
Thank you, Mr. McHattie. We only have 5 seconds left, so Ms. Vignola, if you have a quick 5-second question.
Bien, je vous remercie.
Well, thank you for your time today.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Mr. Green for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question is actually to Mr. McHattie. Mr. McHattie, I've heard anecdotal feedback from some temporary workers in my area who have actually reported of being in instances where their sole job was to repackage PPE from China with labels that say made in Canada. Are you aware of any instances where there is dumping and repackaging of Chinese PPEs into the marketplace, repackaged as Canadian?
I'm not personally aware of any, but if there are, I hope there's a phone number for somebody to call, and that practice would be eliminated immediately.
Well, you may be aware that in some of our early procurement, we had something like 11 million N95s procured. 9 million had to go back, or they weren't properly actually tested. So what would be some of the other challenges that you might have from your perspective as a local domestic manufacturer in seeing potential international dumping within our markets?
At least in my experience, and I'm speaking of the products that Tenaris makes, which are steel pipes for Canada's energy sector, and we do see unfair trade and utilize the Canadian International Trade Tribunal and the Canadian Border Services Agency. There's a specific process that we follow, and while we believe that Canada has a very strong trade remedy regime, it can always be improved, because in my view, those that are seeking to cheat the system will continue to evolve and cheat the system. And so,
last question. It's pertaining to some of my earlier questions to Ms. Bull. Do you also support the set-aside program, and would you support a set-aside program on a move-forward basis for Aboriginal procurement as it relates to these existing government programs?
Yes, I definitely support the
Sorry, actually, Ms. Bull, the question was Mr. McHattie from the manufacturing perspective. We're looking for some allyship here in the committee.
Oh, without a doubt, this is something that we support, and Canadian Manufacturers Association and Exporters Association has a Manufacturing of the Future Council and Workforce of the Future, and our interest is in creating diverse streams of employment. So bringing in underrepresented people into our manufacturing sectors. We think that's going to make us stronger, not only for having them, for being there, but also the ideas and the skills that they will contribute. And so anything we can do to incentivize this and procurement opportunities for our Indigenous businesses, businesses of equity, this is something that Canada's manufacturers is 100% behind.
Thank
So
you,
it sounds
Mr.
like
Thank you.
there's no excuse for us not to go in that direction. Thank you, Mr. McCaddy. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me squeeze
Thank you.
that in.
Ms. Harder, we're back to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess, Ms. McCaddy, I can appreciate that you mentioned that in between meetings you could send a note. And I understand that that is one form of communication. However, in your comments, you also just said that you found the conversations very insightful or very helpful, which tells me that there's a lot to be gained when people are brought together, that they're at the same table, collaborating in the same room at the same time. So I would gather from your comments then that actually a lot was missed when meetings weren't called for long periods of time in between. Again, there was a long period of time of 3 weeks in May, and then another long period of time from the end of May to the end of June. And then there was another 6-month period from the end of June to December. So that's a lot of waiting time between meetings and opportunities that are missed, to your point, where conversations can be had that are incredibly insightful and altogether helpful, not only for you as industry leaders, but of course for the minister as well. And so it's interesting to me that the council was formed, and this is supposed to be a place where it's the meeting of the minds. It brings people together where they're able to put forward different ideas and engage perhaps even in debate, in lively discussion for the sake of coming up with new and innovative ideas. It's confounding to me then why the minister wouldn't call a meeting more regularly, especially at the beginning of the pandemic when things were being figured out. Wouldn't you agree with me that holding a meeting where people can collaborate is important?
I don't disagree with you, and I think looking back, it would have been great to have some meetings between June and now, and I think although there were other vehicles to do so, more conversations are better, and the pandemic might be something that we have today, but there are structural things that we can resolve for the future so that we can have a stronger and more vibrant economy, and have somewhere where Canadians can be proud of, for example, their manufacturing sector and choose manufacturing from Canada more frequently than they do today.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that, Mr. McCaddy, because I think as well, to your point, you know, we want people at the table who have the experience, who have the ingenuity, who have the work ethic, who have the ability to solve problems and put forward creative solutions. And I think this committee, or this council, I should say, originally started out at that place where the minister had chosen 16 incredibly well-credentialed individuals who should be at that table. But then it is confounding to me as to why those voices weren't utilized to the extent that they could have been. Now, one of the things that I've observed from the conversation today, Ms. Bull, you mentioned that there were 4 scheduled meetings when you look back at your notes, but when we go online, we only see evidence of 3. Do you know why we wouldn't have evidence of a 4th meeting and why minutes wouldn't be reported out to the public?
No, I can't answer that.
Okay. The other thing that I noticed is that, again, online, each meeting is summarized by only a paragraph. Maybe, Ms. Bull, you can help me understand, how long were these meetings?
So the meetings were scheduled 1.5 hours to 2 hours. And as Mr. McCaddy said, we did have quite an extensive roundtable in those meetings sharing ideas.
Okay. Do you have any idea as to why we wouldn't have a better idea as to what happened to those in those meetings? Why so much information would be kept secret from the Canadian public?
I would not be able to answer that, no.
Okay. You have no insight as to maybe information that just would have been private in nature, something that would have been dangerous to make available to us as Canadians?
No,
You were in those meetings, weren't you?
I was, yes.
Okay. And so in your minds, could the information have been made public without any problems?
From the meetings that I was on and the information that I shared, I would have no concern with it being made public.
Okay.
I concur.
Thank you, Mr. McCaddy. I appreciate that. I think that concludes my time. Mr. Kitchen, you're muted.
Finally, thank you. I got myself caught on not hitting the right button. Thank you very much, Ms. Harder, and appreciate that. And so I ate up your extra 20 seconds just by missing the mute. We'll go now to Mr. Kuzmierczak. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to say that I am connecting from the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. I just wanted to thank you both for your testimony, your answers as well. And thank you so much for your service and being part of and advancing what is the largest peacetime mobilization of industry since the Second World War. The Supply Council obviously has played an important role in terms of our procurement strategy. And I just wanted to ask you, sort of looking forward, what role do you think the Supply Council could play even moving forward after the pandemic? And is there a role for the Supply Council moving forward?
I can start with that one. Yeah, I do think that the Supply Council, it was as an Indigenous person and running an Indigenous Business Association, it was definitely an honor that there was a place for us to speak about the importance of Indigenous business and minority-owned businesses. And as Minister McCaddy said, there was some great opportunity for us to work together with larger manufacturers as a small, representing small business. So I think that is a real opportunity for us to continue to collaborate as Canadians and to support business across. And I do think that there is an opportunity for us to continue to work to look at how we can move procurement in Canada forward and how we can find ways for collaboration.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure. I mean, we served at the pleasure of who we were asked, and I think we enjoyed participating. I know many of us are also participating in different ways in other places, but certainly having people get together and share their ideas, and there are certainly more questions now to answer for what we want the Canadian economy to look like going forward. And I know the Industry Strategy Council is another place where a lot of these things were discussed, not necessarily COVID-19 related, but the solutions might all be very similar. And so it was great to have such a diverse group of people together discussing these things, and would be happy, always happy with anybody to further those conversations.
Yeah, I was just curious, and I appreciate those answers very much. I'm just curious whether the collaboration and the conversation within the Supply Council also spilled out outside of the Supply Council. Did you find that taking place as well between the members, or just curious?
Certainly, and even I personally didn't know Minister Anand at all before, and really appreciated the opportunity to share ideas with her, and I have a very positive view of her now as a result, and of many of the other council members, some of whom I already knew, and some I did not, and they're good opportunities. It's tough in a video world. It's not the same as when you can get together in person, but I hope that we're able to do this more in the future in some other form or in that form.
Yeah, and I think that anyone that's had any kind of interaction with Minister Anand has come out with the same impression as well, too, positive impression. We definitely have a tremendous leader there. I do have another question. I know that the terms of reference for the Supply Council could have been changed over time. I know that was part of the mandate. Did the terms of reference evolve over the life of the Supply Council, or did it remain the same? Just curious.
they remain the same. They didn't change.
I guess the final question, I know I have got less than a minute left here, but did digitalization and technology factor into the conversation of the Supply Council, just in terms of how those could be used to improve federal procurement?
But not only with regard to federal procurement, but also in sharing best practices and insights. And if you remember back to those earlier days, ways where we could connect on the ground with from the largest corporations to SMEs who are all manufacturing. Sharing information was very valuable, and the tool that was developed, the Supply Hub, was a kind of a digital tool that can, I think, even be expanded further.
Thank you, Mr. McCaddy. And we have 2 seconds left, Mr. Kazmierczuk, so I'm assuming you're going to turn that down.
I'll share that with Kelly.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Paul. We're going into our third and final round, and we'll go with Mr. Paul Hughes. And if anybody else wants to help get us back on time quickly, we appreciate that time frame. Mr. Paul Hughes.
Merci, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to come back a bit to the concept of the operations of your committee, because I have divergent information about its vision. When the council was established, the minister mentioned that the Supply Council was not supposed to address gaps in the supply itself, but to provide another lens on the issue. So it was more of an advisory board than a council. But Prime Minister Trudeau said that the council will work to ensure that Canada has enough ventilators, masks, and hand disinfectant, and other items to ensure that we can fight the pandemic. So what I see and what I've heard today, you were called upon to give advice for potential solutions, but you were not really involved in operations. So the Prime Minister said that you were there to help operations. So is it the Minister's version or the Prime Minister's version?
Monsieur McCaddy.
Mr. McCaddy?
I think and that it's a tough question for a member of the council to answer. I think everything was open to us, and I didn't feel like someone was putting handcuffs on us and saying, don't suggest this or don't provide your view on that. Everything was open to us, and I thought we had fairly broad conversations to cover both, and we went into some specifics where there were specific ideas.
So you were really in conversation mode and giving ideas, but in your opinion, the advice that were given in those meetings, did you see changes in procedures and acquisition of equipment, or were these just meetings for show?
They were certainly not meetings for show from my perspective, and I doubt from anyone on the council. There were the initiatives that we didn't do personally, but we gave some feedback on, like the Supply Hub, like the strategic. Sorry if I find my notes. The contingency reserve for strategic products, the contingency reserve. These were ideas that were, that resulted that I think the minister's department were thinking of, and they shared them with us and asked for feedback. So I think there were some outcomes, but we were advisory.
Okay.
Do you have questions or concerns concerning the origins of masks from China? For example, we know that factories there use forced labor. Did you raise the issue, because we know that at the beginning there was a lot of material arriving? Did you raise concerns about that?
We definitely tried to promote the difference between something made in Canada and what's made in other places. And with certain, there were some of us who would have intervened, talking about why we should try and develop more local supply chains for diversity reasons, for inclusivity reasons, and for our economic recovery. When you spend $1 in Canada, it's powerful.
Dans les fameux contrats.
In the infamous contracts that were given, there was a lot of purchase of PPE. We know that astronomical sums were given to businesses, but we weren't able to get any other information to know whether the quality was up to par. Were you also concerned about this?
It wasn't something that we were, so to say. Of course, we're concerned about the quality and the safety and the sustainability of any of the products, but we didn't weigh in on any specific trade-offs. We were advisory. We weren't making any kind of an operational position on what was bought from where. We did not discuss specific companies or specific products. If you look at a ventilator has 1,500 inputs, we did not talk about those 1,500 inputs as an example. Just at least from my perspective, at Canadian manufacturers and exporters, we were more conceptual and of course we talk about the quality from Canada being of a high level. We wouldn't disparage other people's quality.
Thank you, Mr. Paul Hoos. And I believe I'm correct in saying that it's now Mr. McKinnon filling in for Mr. Drouin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I am here from the other side of the Ottawa River, from the territory of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin people. Thank you to our witnesses.
Paul, for Ms. Bull for being with us today. I had the pleasure as Parliamentary Secretary at PSPC of sitting in on a number of those supply council meetings, and I want to thank our witnesses for their time, their expertise, their insights, and their knowledge. And frankly, Mr. Chair, I find this badgering about what was discussed at these meetings a little tawdry and certainly unproductive on the part of the opposition. What you have were conversations and people from all walks of life, notably from the business community, asked to, during a crunch time for Canada, I think it's a matter of public record, that we were in a PPE crunch, and we called out to representatives across the country to come and counsel the minister and the government on these issues. And I know that their advice was very well taken and very well received. And in that spirit, I want to kind of further the conversations that went on in the Minister's Supply Council and ask, about next steps. And perhaps we'll start with Mr. McHattie. From your perspective at Canadian manufacturers and exporters, what are the barriers that you see that remain to continuing to evolve a domestic supply chain for PPE, for any of the sort of health-related applications that were discussed and were outlined, and that now with about a year's worth of hindsight, are things that could be productive, that governments could be productively doing to help Canadian manufacturers get a bigger foothold in this segment?
Certainly, that's a great question. Although I certainly don't mind. I didn't consider it badgering, and I think the work that's done by members of Parliament in trying to hold the administration to account, I think is perfectly fine and acceptable, and so I'm okay with that. However, I want to bring it up a level. What is it that we can do better in Canada to attract investment in Canadian manufacturing, regardless if it's PPE or it's biosciences or whatever it is? Now, think about things in terms of when you invest in new capital equipment, you're investing in a higher technology, a more advanced technology. It's more likely to have digitization, have automation, have kind of the industry 4.0 Internet of Things. This is something that Canada, as ranked of OECD countries, we're kind of near the end of the list, not at the front of the list. And so, and the trend, we can, I'd say, we would like that trend to be reversed. And so we need to find ways to attract investment in Canada. And so there are kind of two aspects to that. We can compare ourselves to the United States, and we can compare ourselves to other OECD countries. And so I think the Industry Strategy Council, that report is an extremely good report for someone like me who loves to think and talk about that. It's tough for Canadians to read all of these detailed things. It's easy to say, well, we should have lower taxes competitively, and we should find a way that companies have more to reinvest. And we need to partner with companies to invest more. And so we need to do a lot more of this. Innovation is not only in R&D and in new concepts, new ideas. Innovation is in applying what's available today. When you're a manufacturer, you need to keep investing in your manufacturing equipment. And so every time you do something new, it is going to be more innovative. So to me, I think we have a great opportunity to do more of that. And I would like to connect lessons we learned in the COVID-19 supply response with those broader manufacturing investments. And I think we have opportunities to take.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. I just want to turn, do I have any time left, Mr. Kitchen?
You have, Ms. Bull has 10 seconds if she wants to add a quick response.
I apologize, but perhaps my next colleague can give you the floor.
Thank you. We'll now go to Ms. Vignola for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kitchen. In the comments you made, you talked a lot, Mr. McCaddy and Ms. Bull, about this too, and I think that my question will be for you, Ms. Bull. You talk a lot about drawing investors, attracting investors and investments, creation of jobs, and so on. And the idea is not to draw it from overseas, but incite interest within Canada. Is that still possible? Can we do that? Or are we still waiting for the money to come from outside of Canada?
I will start. I think that we definitely can do that. I think we've demonstrated the innovation is alive in Canada, and particularly by continuing to support that fabric of small, medium enterprise and the innovative thinking that we're seeing happening at that level and continuing to sustain those businesses. We have an opportunity to be at the forefront of innovation. Also ensuring that we're stimulating that research and institution that exist here.
Merci.
Thank you. I don't know how it worked and what the incentives were. Do you receive any kind of compensation for your time or honoraria? Was it volunteer or was there some kind of honoraria system?
No, it was all volunteer. I think, I think if I was not on the Supply Council, I would not have the audience that I have today. As an Aboriginal Business Association, this is an important audience for us, and the opportunity to be on the Supply Council and support that work continues to help us work to support Indigenous business.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. That's everything for me. I wish you all a nice evening, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ms. Vignola. And in light of the time that we're at, we're going to suspend after Mr. Green. So, Mr. Green, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Bull had referenced some of the barriers to traditional financing. She may have caught that this government released $750 billion in equity supports, liquidity supports to Bay Street, our big banks. I'm wondering, was there any spillover? Were there any earmarked programs in terms of the money and the liquidity supports that were provided through our financial institutions that would have been directed directly to Aboriginal businesses?
So as the Canadian Council, we do have an MOU. We work very closely with EDC and BDC in supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs, and they are making some significant progress. And we're able to see some real gains in that area in the work that they're doing directly with Indigenous entrepreneurs, but also in finding opportunities for partnerships with non-Indigenous businesses. So we are seeing some good progress there.
More specifically, and to the point, $750 billion roll out in the course of a COVID response, paper purchase buyback program through the Bank of Canada, and I'm wondering if in this newfound financial liquidity support, if any of that landed within Aboriginal-led programs or directed programs.
Thank you. I do not have that answer at this time.
I want to leave you with the last minute and 30 seconds to say whatever you think that you had begun to say or anything that you think you may have missed that we can provide as recommendations on a move forward.
Thank you, Miigwech. I think, as I said, that the Supply Council was an opportunity for us as an Indigenous association and as other minority associations to have a voice at a table that maybe we don't always have the opportunity to have. And that conversation did lead to the Supply Hub. I did find an opportunity when mentioning the Indigenous businesses that could provide PPE. There was follow-up to ask who those businesses were, and there was a link to the Supply Hub to the list of businesses that can provide PPE. So that is definitely a step in the right direction. However, I do stress again that this needs to be a government-wide solution and a government-wide Indigenous entrepreneurship strategy, not something that sits within one ministry. Within every program that comes out of ISED or NRCan, we need to be looking to ensure that those programs meet the needs of Indigenous businesses and that Indigenous businesses have the same opportunity to participate in those programs. And that is something that we're pushing for very hard in our upcoming budget submission as well. And I think we also need to really look at the opportunity and the propensity of Indigenous businesses to export, both generally in the US and Australia, but also the opportunity for them to participate in export dialogues with their Indigenous counterparts in Australia, New Zealand, US, and across the globe.
Thank you, Ms. Bull, and thank you, Mr. Green. Appreciate that. And thank you to Ms. Bull and Mr. McHattie for being here today and bearing with us as we had dealt with the challenges of the telecommunications. I appreciate your comments and staying with us this whole time. At this point in time, the public portion of the meeting is now complete, and we will be going in camera. And so thank you to the witnesses. You're free to go. And to the members of the committee, you will have been sent from the clerk page that basically indicated how to get onto this meeting and then how to get on the in camera. You will have to get out of this meeting completely and then re-enter through the in-camera portion with the new code. So we will see you in about 5 minutes, hopefully, as quickly as we can reconvene. Thank you, everybody. We'll
Bye.